I'm building a massive aquarium in my hardcore Minecraft world. And no, it's not just for the blue axolotls behind me. I'm building a special tank for an octopus. Let me show you what I mean. I have all this space on the side of the aquarium building, and I'm deciding to add a large tank. I added these gradient walls to emphasize a sense of depth, and then I built this cute little submersible as a reference to this larger submarine I made in a previous episode. Then I used warp vines in place of kelp. Next I added a little bit of seafloor landscaping. And then I got started on building my octopus using the armorstand mod made famous by players like Zombie Cleo of Hermitcraft. This mod allows you to make some pretty cool things. Hours later, my design was complete. I had a few final small details, including some turtle eggs to make it look like she's protecting her nest, and this arched stone design to make it look more cave-like. And that's it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments and look for the full episode soon.